Roland, one thing became crystal clear after this week's CNN GOP debate. All of the Republican candidates plan to attack President Obama's record on the economy. Let's look at that record. Today, we have a 9.1% jobless rate. We have an exploding budget deficit, and we have economic growth that's simply not enough to create new jobs. We measure economic growth, you guys, in GDP. If you look at here, you can see, though, growth has climbed out of the gutter since 2009, when it was shrinking at a rate of 2.6%. That was horrible. But now it is growing at 1.8%, not as strongly as last summer, but that's when stimulus measures were in full effect. And right now it's simply not enough to meaningfully lower the unemployment rate, but it has climbed out of that gutter. Now, for most people, the economic indicator that matters the most is their job. In January 2009, when President Obama took office, 820,000 jobs were lost in that 1 month. Overall, 3.3 million jobs are gone since Obama became president. But the White House is right when it points out that job growth over the past year, some 1.4 million jobs have been added over the past year. Roland, if a voter is basing his or her choice on the economy, can President Obama win on this economic record?
Well, first of all, they have to make the argument. You saw Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz this week say we own this economy. She also began to articulate that the turnaround started because of our policies. Now, sure, nobody wants to sit here and be honest and say, hey, we were in a ditch, we were horrible, it was just a terrible economy, which is all true. But also, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke has said this is going to be slow growth. What Americans can't get used to is the fact that we're not going to have some huge explosion overnight and we're going to see massive jobs. We put ourselves in a horrible situation, and when you do that, it actually takes time. Now, folks may not buy it, but it's also a reality. And every Republican can talk about tax cuts. We know that tax cuts under President George W. Bush contributed to our deficit. We have to own up to that. But many of them don't want to do that.
All right. Harvard professor Ken Rogoff is the former chief economist at the IMF and an expert, the expert on financial crises. Ken, simplest terms possible, with the recovery apparently weakening, how real is the threat of slipping back into another recession? Or does it feel so dismal to the American middle class it doesn't matter anyway?
It definitely feels so dismal to the American middle class that it's not going to feel great no matter what. I think we can expect a slow, halting recovery. We could go into a technical recession where output's actually falling and we're losing jobs instead of creating them. I think we'll continue to get jobs, but this could take years before we really feel completely better.
Christine, 1 second. We keep saying the economy is weakening, but we're basing that on what? One jobs report? I mean, the reality is this here. We're going to have starts and stops. Again, we keep trying to compare 1984, 1992, when Clinton was there, and we think that all of a sudden we're going to see 300,000 and 400,000 jobs created. Also, the American consumer has changed in that our spending habits have changed. Our economy is so predicated on spend, spend, spend. People have finally gotten the message. I can't just keep spending like I used to. I need to have some discipline and focus personally when it comes to my checkbook.
Christine, let me say this to Roland. If the economy isn't weakening, we can at least say it's not getting better. And here's why. The main problem in the economy, the seed, the cancer in the economy is debt. And I'm not talking about just federal government debt, household, historic levels of debt. Now, listen. Ken Rogoff knows a lot more about this economy than I could ever pretend to. And if I was at a dinner party, I'd ask questions instead of give opinions. So I'm not going to pretend to do much different here. And what I'd ask Ken is this. Ken, you've said the same thing about debt. And you have said that the mortgage market, housing market is at the core of that. And we have to look at write-down, principal write-down, debt relief. But here's my question for you, Ken. If you do that, aren't you rewarding like a decade's worth of bad behavior? Isn't it essentially saying the idiots won?
Well, you have to do it in a way where there's some give back. So if you write down people's mortgages, they have to give back some of the upside. If prices go back, you have to design a program where there's some penalty for it. But, you know, you're absolutely right that there's so much debt out there. Consumer debt is really double what it was maybe 30 years ago. And if this is not a typical recovery because of the debt, that's what's making it slower.
Ken, how do you deleverage that?
But Will, here's my problem. You keep saying rewarding those people who made some mistakes. Here's the problem with that. The people actually who did make mistakes, guess what? our home prices have fallen as a result of this situation. Secondly, you're seeing school districts, hospital districts having to cut services because the property values have dropped. So when you say reward those people, you also are looking at an entire economy affected by the drop in home prices.
Well, I want to ask
and sales taxes as well.
I want to ask Ken a little bit about this whole idea of a zombie consumer, because that's something that, I mean, it could take years, and you said it yourself, Ken, it could take years for the consumer to have a balance sheet that's repaired enough so that they can actually be powerful again in the economy. Am I right here? I mean, there's a lot of debt that we still have to work through. As much as we've already done, there's a lot more to go.
There really is. I mean, I actually think having some inflation would be helpful to try to bring wages and up relative to all these debts. There's not another pretty way to do it. We also can go in and try to write down the debts. There's not an easy out, but it's not also time to panic. I think these people are proposing massive stimulus again, more government spending. This isn't a typical recovery. Debt is the problem. And if the government's going to spend money, it ought to be on something to bring down all the household debt.
Let me ask you a quick question, because you're going to get Republicans and Democrats, Ken, who are arguing immensely over the Bush tax cuts. 10 years. 10 years. Exactly. We've been talking about Bush tax cuts. Did they contribute, and how much, to our debt problems?
Well, I think Will hit the nail on the head with what we need, and it's the problem with the Bush tax cuts. We need to get rid of as many deductions as possible, lower the tax rate so people have incentives to work, to build, to create. President Bush, the tax cuts were fine, except that was an opportunity to improve the tax system, to reform it. We made it messier. Right. And now the tax rates are really low. It's harder to do the reform because it's harder to do it in some way that everybody gets something.